Consciousness doesn't exist. What? But I'm conscious. This is obviously bullshit. I think, therefore I am. Okay, let me get two things out of the way. First, let me distinguish that when I say consciousness, I don't mean being awake. I'm talking about the experience of color and thought, and of you being here right now, perceiving the world from the perspective of yourself. Second, let me clarify that electric impulses exist, action potentials exist, and information in your brain exists. But when we think of that special experience inside our heads that separates us from machine, that doesn't exist. So I came to this conclusion by originally thinking about my own conscious experience and comparing it to a computer and asking myself, well, if brains are just super complex machines, then why doesn't a computer experience? What is in my brain that adds this video of the current moment that I am watching? Well, while the video part might be easily located in the occipital lobe, and the I part might be centralized in the frontal lobe, the watching part is not located in any specific area. When I realized that I couldn't answer where is consciousness, I eventually turned to the question, what is consciousness? And that's when I came to the conclusion that consciousness was the watching of the movie full of taste and smell and sound. And this process was all an illusion. So what creates this illusion? Well, at this point, it's actually a very easy question to answer, and it's nothing new. There is an interaction or exchange and modification of information between every synaptically linked nuclei in the brain. The interactions of particular interest are the ones between the neural networks of the frontal lobe and the rest of the brain, since the results of these interactions actually reach awareness via the attention and self subsystems of the frontal lobe, which is where you live. The frontal lobe gets particular mention, again, because it's involved in the self-analysis. Again, it's responsible for the I part of the brain, but it alone cannot explain how I experience. The perception part is a result of the interaction between every communicating neural network within the whole brain. But the frontal lobe is an important half of the process, so we'll come back to it in a bit. The other half of what we experience as conscious perception is a result of the neural networks reacting to the input. Every interaction between two or more neural networks is where the illusion of consciousness takes place. To clarify, we have input, then the interaction, and output. Now, the input can be environmental stimuli or prior brain activity, and the interaction part is akin to a simulation of the world encoded in the pattern of information. The brain simulates the world and a conscious self perceiving the world and reacts to the interaction between the two. And here, these simulations that each nuclei in the entire brain reacts to is where watching of the movie occurs. For example, when we perceive red in a specific area of our visual field, it's because of the activation of a network that becomes activated whenever the external stimuli of red is present in that specific area of our visual field. But we can unconsciously perceive red and react to it even without realizing that it's there. We consciously watch red because the rest of the brain is reacting to the electrical pattern that represents red. Specifically, the frontal lobe is reacting. So too, when we experience a certain thought, it is because the rest of the brain is reacting to a specific network that would cause the rest of the brain to react to that thought. The thought itself doesn't physically occur anywhere. What really occurs is the rest of the brain reacting to a specific area being activated. So, is the thought physically located in the area being activated, or in the rest of the reacting brain? Neither. It exists only as a simulation within the interaction, which might mathematically exist, but does not physically. So, if you think of a scary monster, you might react to the thought, even though the monster doesn't actually exist. Consciousness exists akin to how the monster exists. It doesn't, but you still react to it. Now, a network representation of thought is simply responsible for asking the rest of the brain, how would you react to me being activated? It doesn't know that it's representative of a pleasurable thought or a fearful thought. It simply activates, and its interaction with the rest of the brain creates the simulation of consciousness. We end up with an entire brain constantly interacting with itself, exchanging information and creating an output at any given moment as a result of the spatial location of activated networks, the output being the rest of the brain's reaction. If we think about it, this makes chronological sense. After input, the information is exchanged between neurons, and here the simulation happens. Then, the rest of the brain reacts, and here conscious perception happens. And if you think hard enough about your own experience with consciousness, you might realize that it's really just watching our brain's reactions play out. They've done studies, and brain activity occurs well before conscious recognition of decisions and even muscle movement. The pleasure center was activated, and you experience feeling good. The fear center was activated, and suddenly you experience dread. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but all this really happens. Where does the illusion part come into play? So, notice that everything I've described happens in a computer too. Input, interaction, output. What computers don't yet have is the illusion, because they don't yet have self-analysis powerful and complex as our frontal lobes to create the I part. This is where the illusion lies. Our brains are analyzing everything we experience in this world, and eventually it gets to ourselves, and our frontal lobes step in. Our frontal lobes analyze our mood, our sleepiness, our hunger, and our world, constantly questioning everything. When we get drunk, our frontal lobes get a little bit inhibited, so we question things, including our own thoughts, a little bit less. You could say we're even a little less conscious. Now, when the brain finally gets around to analyzing itself, the brain doesn't know that it's a brain. You can teach it that it's a brain, but you can't unteach it the original answer that it gave itself for the question, how am I perceiving? The answer it gave itself was, because I'm conscious. I think, therefore I am. This is the illusion. This is where the frontal lobes are ignorant of their input. The complexity of the input and interaction is so incomprehensible that instead of coming to the conclusion, hey, I'm just the frontal lobe getting input from the rest of the brain, the frontal lobe, which has no idea what it is, lies to itself and tells itself that there's a screen on which it watches the world, the screen of consciousness. And it proves this to itself. How? Well, it's obvious. I think, therefore I am. Since it simply cannot comprehend its own complexity, it's simply ignorant of the input. But in reality, there is no consciousness, only a bunch of brain cells propagating a pattern of electric information that represents a simulation of a self interacting with a simulation of the world. While the brain cells are akin to a computer's hardware, these simulations are akin to the running of a software code that exists only virtually, like a World of Warcraft avatar. Now, when early humans started prying into the hardware of the brain and could find no screen on which consciousness is displayed, consciousness, or the soul as it was known at the time, was assumed to be non-physical. Which is ironic, since that obviously translates today into either electromagnetic or non-existent. In fact, Religion is a fantastic example of how our brain answered the question of how do I perceive? Because much of religion was created to explain what we couldn't comprehend. We convinced ourselves of religious enlightenment when we couldn't comprehend the world around us. The weather was God, and we convinced ourselves of consciousness when we couldn't comprehend ourselves. These two delusions are so closely tied since our frontal lobes desperately needed to create a logic for it not knowing the answers. And the logic it created was that the answer must be unexplainable by humans. Thus, we formed the belief that there was simply no way for a human to comprehend the soul or consciousness. Only God could know. Narcissism played a role as well. Yes, we weren't as special as God, but humans were more special than animals. Thus, some religious individuals still today believe that animals are not conscious, or less conscious, which is very comparable to the common belief that computers will never be conscious. So here lies the delusion. The brain naturally lied to itself because it couldn't possibly know the truth. And now we go through life feeling like our experience is something more than just a bunch of mathematical equations playing out on the hardware of brain cells. But it's an illusion. What you experience is a simulation, a calculation of input and output, just like a computer does, albeit a very complex one. But when you feel consciousness, that doesn't exist. So back to the question, why doesn't a computer experience consciousness? Well, when we realize our experience is just a simulation, we can recognize that if that computer has any amount of self-analysis, then it does experience. Just to the degree of maybe a cockroach. See, what we call consciousness exists on a spectrum, with anything that self-analyzes being somewhere on that spectrum. A single line of code might be as conscious as a short strand of DNA. And its simplicity and limited self-analysis makes a calculator's consciousness analogous to a bacteria's. But once you get to the complexity and self-analysis of an animal, it doesn't matter what hardware the pattern is run on. The computer will be what we call conscious. Now, if you can look at your computer and admit to me that it's on the spectrum of consciousness, then fine. Dislike this video and leave a comment that consciousness does exist. I figured that would be hard for society to do, so I decided to ditch the concept of consciousness entirely and instead opt for the mindset of recognizing that the mathematical and virtual calculations in our brains and computers don't actually exist. They're illusions, simulations, which only result in a physically existing output. And consciousness can be a great label for all the neural network interaction going on inside our brains, but I don't want to pretend that we're special or unexplainable. So, while the behavioral output of all that interaction can physically be real, the neural interactions themselves and the brain's reaction to them is nothing more than the mathematical equations playing out, just like in a computer. In conclusion, no matter how you cut into, conceptualize, or image the brain, you will never find the source of consciousness. There is no centralized screen with our lives playing on it. But it's still kind of cool that your brain tricked itself into thinking there was. Ooh, say hi. Say hi. We have to get them views somehow. Come here. Say hi. We have to get those views somehow. Gotta get them clicks. Ooh, gotta get them likes. Like this video or Ginger will hate you forever. I don't want that. Nobody wants that.